So in fact, if you really wanted to protect the older people, perhaps you wouldn't have been not testing those who come into contact with them, but you would have set up creative ways so that they had little bubbles around them, maybe in their family homes. I'm sure it is not to lock down the entire society, because that way we don't produce any kind of immunological defense. And then, those older people are potentially much more vulnerable down the track.
You're listening to the Deep Trouble podcast. Dr. Mark Halloran in conversation with Professor Gigi Foster from the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales Business School.
I guess we've got the example of the UK, where they originally tried to do something like what you talked about on Q&A, where they had an optional lockdown for older people. And now the UK is proportionally larger in terms of death rate than the US. So we look at those examples. But the other thing was psychologically, if you can imagine it, let's say that we tried to emulate Taiwan, which could be possible. I think Taiwan had the best policy around this. They were able to keep their economy open because their population, as I said, was almost militant in its understanding of how to do this. And then the death rate here went to 10 or 20,000. Psychologically, wouldn't the government then reverse on its decision to try and implement those changes and then go into a severe lockdown? And so then we'd have 10 to 20,000 deaths plus a severe lockdown. And so you've got the economic impact of the deaths plus a lockdown.
Well, again, I feel that's somewhat of a disparaging comment upon the level of education and sophistication of the Australian population and our politicians. I mean, are we living on this side of the Enlightenment or not?
I mean, I know people that, that fear, the strongest and oldest emotion of mankind is fear. And you start to see those numbers and it starts to have, and breakouts in communities, and you have this feeling of the rice on the chessboard type of idea.
Yeah, look,
I
agree. Fear is an incredibly powerful motivator, and it does block out anything that isn't the feared object, right? And it's just not see those other things. And you also in Australia have a very strong sense of needing to be with the group, so there's a very strong vitriolic attack against people who are not towing the line in relation to pretty much anything where there's a clear, correct opinion to have amongst powerful or the people who are being listened to, being printed in the media. And so those two elements are, of course, definitely negative. But we see, for example, in Sweden, you don't see the level of fear of this thing that you do in other countries. And that is partly down to the government messaging, government stepping up, realizing what you were saying, which is a learning from social science. Fear is powerful, right? Okay, that means that we got to treat this thing. We got to treat the fear head on with our policy, with our messaging. And that's something the Australian government just, they gave up on around mid-March. I think right after the Imperial College London modelling came out, which was somewhere around mid-March, Australian politicians pretty much stopped trying to downplay at all the danger of this thing, which previously, I think our chief health officer somewhere before the ICL modeling came out had said, look, this thing has usually got very mild symptoms. Correct. Correct, right? But nothing like that was repeated for, afterwards, because there was just no capacity for the politicians to get away with that anymore. And I think they were swept along with the same fear that everybody else was, partly because of this ICL modeling and just, the general lack of awareness, being a deer in the headlights. But I believe in people. I believe in our ability to learn more about our responses and our predilections and our weaknesses. And one of our weaknesses is fear. And if we are putting people in charge of a whole country, those people should bloody well know that fear is extremely powerful and that it needs to be reined in order to not run us over a cliff as a society. And that was something that the Swedish government knew and they acted on. And I believe that we should be able to do that as well in future here. Of course, I would love to see the level of education, the level of economic literacy of Australians rise. It's one of the reasons I do many of the things I do in my job. I try to increase economic literacy and try to provide people the kind of structure or framework for thinking about problems that can reduce their fear by giving them a sense of mastery over the problem, of control over how to think about this problem, right? That intellectual set of tools does provide a bit of an antidote to fear.